Hi everyone, it's Knife22 here. I hope you are all well. Welcome to the next opening in the series, and this one's going to be the Sicilian Alapin Variation. Last time I talked about the Sicilian and what a great opening it was. Today I'm actually going to do something which will help counteract the Sicilian. Basically the Sicilian defense, for those of you who don't know, it's a defense c5 defending against the e4 move, just taking control of this d4 square. And there are so many variations with knight f3 and d6, which Sicilian players will be comfortable with. The move c3 is really going to take them out of their comfort zone. Basically, you're trying to control the d4 square with these pawns instead of the knight up to f3, and then trying to control it with your knight, and then playing d4, just because when someone plays the Sicilian, they will really know it inside out. And if you don't know all of those variations yet, and you like playing e4, the Alapin Sicilian will be a lot better for you than to go into some of these variations which you might not be familiar of. Okay, so the move is c3, and this move is really great. As I said before, just taking the player out of their comfort zone, really something a bit different, which a Sicilian player will not see very much. Okay, so there are 4 different variations which I'm going to go over in this particular one. 2 of which are much more common than the other 2, but I'm going to show the 2 very common ones first, and then we're going to talk about the sort of more least common ones. Okay, so the first move which you might see, which black will play, is just to move pawn down to d5, and this move does a couple of things. It attacks the undefended e4 pawn, and if you look from the white perspective, there's no efficient way we can really defend that pawn and gain a good position. So let's look at all the possible ways. We could play our queen to f3, obviously moving your queen to e2, f3, or g4. g4 is the worst one because of the bishop. Moving your queen early on isn't very great, just because the queen is very vulnerable to attack. Most of you will know this if you watch my other opening tutorials. This queen will be very vulnerable out on f3 and being attacked by minor pieces, wasting an initiative. Also, pawn moves like f3 and d3, it just leads to bad pawn structure, and it really looks like the white will have a disadvantage after the exchange variation, because this pawn is on c3 for no reason. The only reason you want this pawn on c3 is so you can strike with d4 and then have a very solid structure like this, not to sort of just have this random pawn blocking your knight from coming out to c3. Okay, so the move that everybody recommends in this move is just to actually capture this pawn onto d5, just because now after queen takes on d5, as I just talked about, this queen can actually be very vulnerable for attack, as you will see in a couple of variations in a second. From here I recommend just carrying on, as I said, pawn up to d4, and from here white has very good central pawn structure. He's got this pawn on d4, supported by the pawn on c3. Both his bishops have got very good access at the moment, and this queen is out vulnerable for attack. So a very decent position from white. Black will probably play his knight up to f6 in this position, just trying to take control of the light squares. And what you want to do is you want to do a similar thing. You just want to play your knight up to f3, further supporting the d4 square. There's not much leverage really. This is what you'll mainly see, this knight to f6 move. And there's also a little useful tactic I like to play after the move knight c6, which you'll see probably at least 90% of the time. It's to actually just play a knight out to f3, sorry, out to a3, and you'll be thinking for a second, hang on Mr. Knife22, this goes against your rulebook. You say never move out a knight to the rim of the board because it's grim. And I'll tell you why it's grim, because this knight on a3 can only go to 4 different squares, as out onto d2 it can go onto 6 different squares. So, you know, it's not great, but there is actually a very nice tactic. After knight a3, you can then play a bishop out to c4, and then all of a sudden you get this very strong bishop attacking this queen, and creating some real problems for black in the opening, having to move his queen around. And this knight, they can always come out to c4, or even back to c2, and it's got some very nice outpost squares, such as e3, or if it comes out to c4, it can come into the e5 square. Okay, so that's the main variation when black plays his pawn out to d5 on move 2. But he may not do this, he might go ahead with something else. And the other really common variation which you may see is just the knight out to f6. This is actually slightly more common than the d5 move. just because I feel that it gives black a more stable position, a less risky position with the queen out in the center. But then in compensation for that, white gets a very strong foundation pawns in the center, as black will have some trouble developing his pawns. Okay, so let's see how that unfolds. From here, I just recommend putting a pawn up to e5, attacking the knight. And this reminds me of the Alapin's defense a bit, where the knight comes out to f6, attacking the undefended pawn, and then white will bring his pawn up to e5, basically to move this knight around a bit and kick it away. Okay, so if we look at this knight's options, it hasn't got many, it's only got one in fact. Going back to g8 is very, very dubious, as after this, white just has complete center control, and there's really not much point in black moving that knight out to f6 in the first place. So you definitely won't see that from any decent player. Moving the knight out to h5 is also dubious, as the queen can just take it, as moving the knight down to g4. And sometimes I actually see the knight come down to e4, which is good because it's actually a mistake, because after the move d3, you'll notice this knight's trapped at all. You can't go to any squares whatsoever. So basically the main move which you will see, the good move for the knight, is just to move the knight out to d5, out to a central square, where it's not too vulnerable for attack. You may sometimes play bishop to c4, but that's not what I would recommend, just because e6 can be playable, and there's really no reason for your bishop to be out on c4. From here, I just recommend going forward with your plan, basically striking ahead with d4. So now you've got this very strong pawn foundation in the center. This is what I was talking about a minute ago, and you're most likely going to see two things, but it ends up in the same position anyway, effectively. So one is pawn takes on d4, and from this is the Smith-Morrow declines, and from here you're probably just going to play a knight up to f3, and you'll notice that black can't take on c3 in this position, just because then the queen will be able to take the knight on d5. So what you're most likely going to see is just knight out to c6, and then you can recapture the pawn on d4. And I think you have a very comfortable game in this position. Even though black's got these two knights out, they can be quite vulnerable for attack, as I just mentioned, and this pawn chain is very hard to break up. Also, you'll notice as these e and d pawns haven't moved, it's going to be very difficult for black to effectively develop both of these bishops to very strong squares. As with you, the bishops are very, very open for attack and can develop very smoothly. The other variation which you may see in this position is just the knight coming out to c6 first. And this is basically the same thing. You're just going to play a knight out to f3, and then the exchange is going to happen. And you'll notice it's exactly the same position. Okay, so there are two more variations which aren't very common, which I just want to go over very quickly now, both of which are quite passive. First one is pawn up to d6, at which point you can just go ahead with the plan pawn to d4, and after an exchange variation, there's really not much, you know, it's a very solid position from both sides, but I really think white just has the upper hand. So obviously black will try and attack this pawn, and you can just defend it. And really, it's not much of counterplay from black whatsoever. It's just quite a passive defense. But some people are good at playing passive defenses, which is why you might see some stuff like this. The other passive one, which you'll probably see, is just pawn up to e6. This one's slightly better, as the bishop's now protecting the pawn on c5. But the good thing about this is usually most players just like to take as well, indicating they're a passive player. And there are a couple of things you may see in this position. You may see d5, going for a kind of French structure. I did a tutorial on the French defense, so I'll put a link up in the video. And from here you can go for an advanced variation, stopping the knight from coming to f6. Basically this position is the French defense, except for the pawns on the c5 square, which gives, on the c-file, which gives white a bit more of an advantage, because one of the main ideas in the French defense was to play a pawn up to c5 and really undermine the d4 square, but black cannot do this in this position as there is no c-pawns. The more common thing which you'll probably see is just a simple knight up to c6. Again, just a simple development move, and you can just play a knight up to f3 and have a very simple game just like this. Okay, so that's pretty much all the variations covered, really. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. It is a great opening, and I hope you enjoyed playing it. Thanks very much for watching, everybody. I've been KnightFighter22. I wish you good luck playing chess, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye, everyone.